Michael Rubin. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author of the Briefing Book on Substack. Now, with Ukraine already appearing to be on board with a version of this proposal earlier in the week, I mean, what do you expect Witkoff and Kushner will actually, one, either focus on during this meeting, but accomplish with this meeting?
Yeah, Omar, it's great to be with you. And diplomacy for the United States is all about getting a deal done that both sides respect and that's sustainable and that our European allies are supportive of as well. And so my hope is that in these talks, we're going to see Ukraine believe and Zelensky believe that he has achieved goals and his goals and gains at the negotiating table that he can live with. My fear is that he's going to get strong-armed, that what we've seen over the past week or so has been a Russia-first diplomacy and a diplomatic initiative to push the argument that Russia wants, which is to take territory from the east and to have that, and pushing that into Ukraine as a piece that they must accept. And so I hope that that isn't what happens, and I hope that Ukraine does get at the table where they believe they can live with.
Well, you know, amid all of this, we've been talking about Zelensky's top advisor resigning as this corruption investigation deepens in the country. And I just wonder, do you think that works against President Zelensky, or is he able to spin this into, I guess, a victory by saying, hey, this shows the system inside Ukraine is working and won't tolerate corruption?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly bad news when your top lieutenant is essentially corrupt and needs to be tossed to the side. That is not a good sign. So there's really no good way to spin it except to say what you just described. But I do think there's enough of a bench in Ukraine to replace him. President Zelensky is the president. He is the decider ultimately. And there is a cleanup that clearly the Ukrainian people will benefit from. But certainly this is not a good look for the president. But Ukraine, we have to be very clear, is a democracy, and it does not suffer from the kind of autocratic corruption that Vladimir Putin has over his country in Russia.
You know, you were just talking about this fear that the Witkoff-Kushner meeting doesn't turn into, you know, sort of strong-arming Zelensky. And, you know, we heard this leaked audio recording this week of White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff advising his Russian counterpart on how to deal with President Trump. You know, look, President Trump has defended that, saying, hey, look, this is just diplomacy at work. This is just how you get to a negotiation. But we also heard Trump frame this peace proposal as a potential breakthrough. I just wonder what you make of that whole dynamic.
Yeah, you know, Omar, it makes sense to try to sell a diplomatic offer. The problem is that the target for sale is the wrong target. Steve Witkoff should not be advising Russia on how to convince Donald Trump to support their deal. He should be trying to convince Russia to support our deal and our arrangement. And so that's where the diplomacy, clearly, the president's right in all these negotiations back and forth. It's inverse. And that's what makes people nervous, is that it's a Russian-driven diplomatic process and ridden negotiation. That's where we get concerned. That's why I think you saw the heavy pushback from Europe, from Capitol Hill, from the Ukrainians as well. Hopefully they're straightening it out right now. But again, that gives one a lot of concern from a diplomatic perspective.
Before we go, I just want to get your take on Venezuela for a minute, because President Trump declaring Venezuelan airspace closed, his biggest warship still sitting off the Venezuelan coast in the Caribbean. I mean, is this Trump just ratcheting up the pressure, or do you see this as actually indicative of a likely imminent attack?
Well, you know, Omar, I served in the State Department early in my career in 2002 when we deployed our forces into Kuwait and sat them there for months before launching an invasion into Iraq. This is all the hallmarks of a slow-moving regime change policy. I think the president and his team, they need to come clean to the American people and to the Congress and seek military authorization for what they're doing, because right now it's still a mystery, and that is not how we should be conducting our foreign policy. Yeah, Laura, first and foremost, I really do hope these two young people pull through and survive. It's a horrible, horrible thing to watch. And having lived in Washington for nearly 3 decades, I know that site well. And D.C.'s a target, and people are vulnerable all the time. And unfortunately, we now saw what happened yesterday. But to this question, you know, the idea that somehow Afghans just show up unvetted in the United States is farcical. That's just not accurate. There are many programs, one in particular, Special Immigrant Visa Program, SIV, which has had strong bipartisan support for years on Capitol Hill. Thousands of people who worked with American forces in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq met conditions through vetting that enabled them to come to the United States. That doesn't mean these are people who aren't going to ever commit a horrific, heinous act like we just saw. But the idea that there was no vetting, that somehow there was a free-for-all, that people walked in from Afghanistan is just not accurate. It's politicizing this. It's unnecessary. We need facts before we need these kinds of statements that are based not on what the long-term process has been for years. That was the process, including during the Trump term number one. And so that's a process that needs scrutiny, clearly, but highly doubtful that this person just came in without anybody checking his background.
Expert and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President Obama, Joel Rubin. Joel, welcome back. Hope you had a great holiday.
You too, Hannah. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much. There has been a lot of back and forth. You and I talk about this, about the revisions to this 28-point peace plan the U.S. initially presented. Any insight into the status of these revisions? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, Hannah, look, this is a document that's live, as we call it in diplomacy, and it's moving back and forth between the two sides. Clearly, the United States, we're the ones that are carrying it back and forth. But I'm very concerned about the details, because the details are what matters in this instance. And we need to make sure, first and foremost, that we are working closely with our European allies on those details as well. And we just don't see that happening right now. What we've seen are documents that the Russians wrote that the United States carried forward, and now we're getting revisions back from the Ukrainians without a clear backbench of support from our allies. And so on the table, questions about annexing land by Russia that's in eastern Ukraine, for example, that Russia doesn't currently have. Questions about security guarantees that the president does not have the authority to provide without congressional support. There's a lot of moving parts here, and so we just don't see it, and that's what's very concerning.
When you talk about, the guarantees that Ukraine is asking for, and of course that land that Russia doesn't have, but Ukraine may have to fork over, do you think is that why Putin is saying the latest proposal is something he can agree to moving forward?
Well, look, the first proposal that Vladimir Putin put forward, that he wrote basically and handed to us, although at first it was seen as an American proposal, that did not include strong security guarantees. And then, of course, Ukraine pushed back and almost got NATO, but not quite NATO support. And so I just don't think we can be clear as to what Putin is going to agree to. But if the United States, if we put forward that we recognize, for example, and this is what's being discussed, that we recognize that the Donetsk, Donbass, these regions that are, again, are in Ukrainian hands, not in Russian hands, that if those become part of Russia, if we recognize that as Russian territory, that may very well give to Russia the wins that they could not achieve on the battlefield without anything in return. It pulls us in further, and it's not clear as to what the long-term stabilizing solution is to this conflict, because Russia will then see gains from having invaded its neighbor and not really any penalties.
I want to ask you about another headline coming out of Ukraine. President Zelensky's chief of staff, longtime advisor, announced his resignation as part of a widening corruption scandal that just happened less than 24 hours ago, after he said Zelensky will not agree to give up any land to Russia in exchange for peace. What do you think is happening behind the scenes here?
Well, I mean, you could be the optimist or the pessimist, and the optimistic take is that democracy in Ukraine, is working. The corruption investigation done by its corruption investigators found the target and the chief of staff, and that's a good thing. And now Ukraine can have more politicians be involved in it, and the policy goes forward. The pessimist would say, why would a chief of staff to the president for several years now be engaging in corruption and not be known to have done so by this president? And so I look at this with a very skeptical eye. I'm concerned that President Zelensky does not have full control of his presidential office. Hopefully this will help him do that in this final stretch of negotiation, because you can't have a corrupt chief of staff if you want to have a legitimate negotiation.
I'm looking at him now. He is always sitting next to Zelensky. You always saw him get off the plane with Zelensky. They work very closely together. Putin wants Ukrainian troops to withdraw from territory his country claims, but he's also ruled out signing any ceasefire deal before that withdrawal. You and I have talked about it, and you and many other experts have said you can't trust Putin. But let's say that happened. He still made it clear he will fight to the last Ukrainian. Do you think Putin will stop at Donbas? What do you think is his end game here?
Well, he's been engaged in this conflict, this military action, going back to 2014. So this is over 10 years. The most violent phase of it, of course, is the one that we're talking about the last 3 years. But this has been Vladimir Putin's goal over time. And his real ultimate goal was to take over Ukraine. Remember, back in early 2022, when he invaded, there was a sense that there was not going to be anything to stop that invasion and that he was going to take control of all of Ukraine. That did not happen because of the Ukrainian resistance and American military support for that resistance, thankfully. But yeah, I think as long as Vladimir Putin is in there, it's always a threat. And so we need to have a diplomatic arrangement to stop this war that disincentivizes him from ever going forward again. And that means NATO membership. That means more aggressive American security guarantees. Anything less than that is always going to leave a window open for Vladimir Putin to pounce when he thinks the time is right.
Staying on the topic of diplomacy, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has been leading the peace deals with both Russia and Ukraine and the Middle East. Based on your experience, Joel, do you think it's wise for the Trump administration to have one person, no matter who it is, for in this instance, Witkoff, to lead all of these negotiations, to lead all of these deals?
Well, you know, look, he has teams, of course, but the question is of whether or not those teams are being maximized and used effectively. And my sense is that they're not in the case of Russia and Ukraine, and that we have a variety of players. General Keith Kellogg, for example, who's supposed to be the envoy on this topic, is sidelined now. And Steve Witkoff, as we've seen in recent weeks, we've seen leaks of memos that he has been advising the Russians on how to lobby President Trump rather than advising President Trump on how to push the Russians towards an end state. So he intellectually, of course, has the capability, but it's clear that in the case of Russia and Ukraine, he's very in deep, and he's being moved back and forth by the Russian negotiations. And I fear that right now we, as a negotiator, are being driven by the Russians rather than us driving the process.
Joel, thank you for that. I'm running out of time. I want to get one more question in. Switching topics, Israeli forces are being investigated over the deaths of 2 Palestinian men. There's video. In the video, they appear to have surrendered. Troops killed them anyway. The ongoing conflicts in the region have fueled concerns that unrest could spill over, undermine the very fragile ceasefire. And again, we talk about this all the time. It's not a peace deal. It's a ceasefire. Could this truce be on its final leg?
Yeah, you know, and summary execution, if that is what it's determined to be, is horrific. It should never occur. Individuals that are detained should be arrested, detained, and prosecuted as necessary. And if that's the case, it should be, and I fully condemn it. I think that what we're looking at in the West Bank, distinct from Gaza, is a very contentious situation right now, where the Israeli government is allowing violence, quite frankly, from settlers in the West Bank to go unfettered. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has tried to cull it back and has publicly called against it, but it continues unabated. And in Gaza, of course, we have this ceasefire where Hamas controls half the territory and is rearming and persecuting people in Gaza as well. Many Palestinians it's killing. And so we have a lot of armed groups in both sides controlling the ground rather than the militaries, meaning Israel in the West Bank, and some international security force in Gaza. And until that happens and those strong militaries take control, we're going to continue to see these rogue gangs and this violence continue.
There's a long way to go in this potential peace process. Joel Rubin, always appreciate your time. Thank you, Joel.
Thanks, Anna.